Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're finally going to be talking about the sophomore album from Yugen Blakrok called Anima Mysterium. So I never reviewed the Black Panther soundtrack properly last year. Hell, I reviewed the movie, most of the soundtrack wound up on Billboard Breakdown anyway, and most of which I had heard hadn't exactly blown me away. And sure, I think some of that might have been my own inflated expectations. It was curated by Kendrick Lamar, for God's sakes. But my general impressions were more that it was solid but lacking immediate distinctive standouts, at least when it came to complete songs. And I make that distinction because if you dig into some individual verses, you can find some real gems. I do credit Kendrick for digging outside the box for MCs who could fit the vibe of the project and the movie overall, rather than just the big names. And if you want one of the most stark examples, we need to talk about Yugen Blakrok, a South African MC featured on the song Ops opposite Vince Staples and Kendrick Lamar himself. And let's not mince words, she totally stole the show with a sort of ruthless, tangled verse full of sci-fi references that seemed to owe more to Wu-Tang than anything else. And that was definitely an impression that continued when I dug up her 2013 debut album Return of the Astro-Goth, the sort of thorny but layered and atmospheric underground hip-hop that fell at the intersection of Company Flow, Deltron 3030, and maybe a splash of Czarface. But where Czarface has always felt like a bit of an exaggerated goof-off, Yugen Blakrok was playing all this deadly straight, very serious, and the sample-rich, dusty beats and her relentless flows proved that she could absolutely sell it. Yeah, there weren't exactly many hooks, but when the rhymes and flows were as hard-hitting as these were, who can really care or complain? In any case, I had the feeling that with the boost coming off the Black Panther soundtrack, she might be able to parlay her sound into something that's tighter, or maybe even more accessible. To a point. I mean, I didn't see the sci-fi stuff going anywhere on an album that's called Anima Mysterium, so alright, what do we get with this? So here's the thing. My plan was to get a review of this album out sometime last week. Hell, I was behind schedule as it was, and this was a pretty great album if you're into this sort of thing at the right time. And you know what, that piece, it's important to note, because projects as dense and meditative as Anima Mysterium are, they're not an easy sell, especially if you're looking for projects with more mainstream accessibility or hooks. And I'll freely admit that this is only music that I will return to at certain times. Now, when I'm in that mood, it's absolutely a go-to project, a measurable improvement over Return of the Astro-Goth with stronger melodies, more propulsive production, and even a few hooks that do manage to come through, kind of low-key, but they work. And on that note, for me, I'm inclined to give it a lot of praise. But I also put it in a similar category as albums from recent years like Paraffin by Arm & Hammer, or especially Honor Killed a Samurai by Ka, coming back from 2016. Slow, drenched in palpable atmosphere, full of spiky but meditative energy that will satisfy any fan of old school hip-hop, and you know what, maybe a few outside of that. It's definitely worth their time. So let's start off with Yugen Blakrok herself, because if you just know her from when she turned up on Ops, you might be a little bit thrown by what she delivers here. The tempos on average are slower, her delivery is more deliberate, not quite as guttural or vicious, her vocabulary is as bountiful as ever, but her delivery is a little more curt and reserved. And if you're looking for the first hurdle to really getting into this project, it will come with some of this style. I made the Company Flow comparison earlier and how Yugen Blakrok isn't exactly interested in slowing down to help you catch up, but you could also tell that LP and Big Just are having a lot of fun in the pileup of wordplay, whereas here, she's not precisely colder, but definitely feels more distant, nestled a little bit deeper than I would advise into the production, to where the slightly more expressive delivery from Historian himself, Kool Keith, and Jack Tripper does make their verses stand out a little bit more. Now again, it's kind of hard for me to criticize this. This is definitely an album where you want to sink into the complicated vibes and parse more of her content line by line, really think it through, where the mystery is part of the magic of how this works at all, but it doesn't exactly give the project an easy entry point if you're looking for one, especially when some of the content can feel so abstract and overloaded with symbolism. So let's get into some of that, shall we? And let me start by saying that Yugen Blakrok's brand of writing is so thoroughly immersed in a cloud of layered fantastical references that it's kind of even tricky to pinpoint a direct parallel. Part wizard-heavy D&D campaign, part Frank Herbert-era Dune, part Cool Keith and Del the Funky Homo Sapien, and yet her allusions to mythology and vintage sci-fi are not so deep that they can't be decoded. Unlike with Shabazz Palaces or some early Aesop rock, you can figure out what's going on some of these songs, and the poetry is often so vivid that the strange iconography is likely very easy to envision in your mind's eye. And part of that is likely driven by the fact that there isn't a larger narrative or overwritten symbology behind a lot of the project. Indeed, the roots of the writing comes in defining Yugen Blakrok's sheer skills and meditative but slippery presence behind the mic. How very Wu-Tang of her, along with a long-running fascination with gothic iconography, or at the very least that brand of theatricality. But that choice of tone means this album is playing everything completely straight without a hint of levity. And given that was something that kind of hurt Deltron 3030's underwhelming comeback album Event 2, I was a little bit stunned that it works as well as it does here. Mostly because the writing is so wrapped up in its own mystique to not break any illusion or wink at the audience, but also because she draws enough allusions to the modern world in order to ground any particular story she might tell. Look at a track like Picture Box, a song that highlights how activists within the culture find their words twisted or bastardized by mainstream media, but also shows how she must live on those frequencies to be heard on what could be their greatest weapon. Then you have the hermetic paranoia in the face of possible apocalypse on Monatomic Mushroom, or the hardened stare into the abyss on Carbon Form, which crystallizes most starkly on the very black anti-fascist closing song Land of Grey. A very dark moment and a rather abrupt way to end the album, but it still highlights how her homeland will never be so easily exploited in the future, as she's that guardian, which kind of hits hard, especially as she doesn't shy away from the hard allegory on Mars attacks surrounding child soldiers. But even then, you can dig deeper, because she's at least somewhat self-aware that the tangle of wordplay can be a bit of a migraine to parse, and she's very much aware that the path she charts could be a lonely one, especially in the face of gods that she seeks on Hydra that sleep in the face of humanity's frailty and failures and might not answer her. Honestly, outside of a wish that a few more personal moments to come through here show more of a personal touch, as she does seem very carefully guarded, I can't really find any issues with the wordplay. A very different style, and I'll take a half dozen listens before you even pick up on half or a quarter of it, but on some level, that's part of the point. That's why it works so well. And yet I wouldn't be so willing to go back to this project if it wasn't for the production. And I'll say this outright, for as much as the writing held my attention, the blur of textured but atmospheric and entirely melodic compositions against the crackling boom-bap percussion, the echoing samples and the scratching, that's what's really gripping it for me. Swapping out many of the woodwind tones of her debut for tones more rooted in jazz and even smoldering rock guitars, it gives this project a more steady groove and a foundation that I found really impressive, and certainly lends the hooks a little bit more staying power and presence and foundation. Like her debut, nearly all the beats were composed by Kanif the Jotmaster, and he lends this album the misty density that also allows it to feel as alien and ethereal, but also rugged and ominous and kind of bleak at spots. And while I could nitpick again and say this project could have done with a little bit more momentum, or at least a few up-tempo songs in order to vary more of the mood, I can't help but feel that would also be kind of missing the point. But that's not saying that there isn't momentum to songs like Gorgon Madonna or Hydra and Picture Box, with the smoky melody playing off the guitar smolder and lonely horns calling across the empty mix, or a sense of creeping dread that sinuously builds off the touches of horns and stalking low end on Obsidian Night or a Monatomic Mushroom, or the faint cascades of keys playing off the horn bombast on Carbon Form, or the grimy lo-fi guitar and jazz flutters on Hibiscus. Hell, the only melody line that I struggled to outright like was the lumbering electronic thing that sounds like it's constantly on the verge of dying as on Ochre. Kind of a shame because I really dug the horns and the bass touches around it. It's got a great groove, and it's one of the cleaner tracks that I could see being more accessible outside of the dusty feel of the rest of the album, but hey, still a good song, just not quite great in my view. But as a whole, again, you need to be in the right sort of mood for this sort of meditative, spacey hip-hop. It's not for the mainstream whatsoever, and I'll definitely argue its appeal is niche, even for me. But you know what, if I'm in that mood, there's little quite like it in taking these sorts of layered Afrofuturist tones and fusing it with an MC who has poetic flair for miles, such vivid imagery. It's a slow burn that simmers against a phenomenal collage of samples and twisty, wiry flows and grooves, and if you can sink into the mist, it paints one hell of a tableau. Now for me, very light 8 out of 10. It only gets better with every single listen as I dig into the finer details. It might grow on me more this year, but yet it's absolutely worth your time. Because while Ops might have introduced her to the wider world, Anima Mysterium proves Yugen Blakrok a singularly unique force to be reckoned with. Get on board, check this out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know this album will not be for everybody. Hell, if you like Company Flow, you'll probably really like this. The production's so good, and a lot of the bars build up in the same way. So if you want to buy or stream the album, link's down there below. And I got the poll up there. I'm curious where her fans will fall on this, because she's still very much underground. I'm curious where things are going to go from there. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And hey, if you want to support the channel, link to my Patreon, it's right over there, where we're currently voting on the next episode of Resonators. And hey, that's underground hip-hop, feels rather telling there. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.